A rich widow, an empty mansion, and a past that wouldn't stay buried. Genevieve Ashcraft had everything money could buy. A sprawling vineyard estate that painted the hills of Willow Ridge in emerald and gold. A manor house filled with priceless art and polished mahogany. She had wealth, respect, and a name that echoed through 3 generations of winemakers. But she had nothing that mattered. Not since the war had stolen her husband, Thomas, and her son, Michael. They had gone off to fight, one driven by honor, the other by youthful fire, and neither had come home. The telegram had arrived 3 years ago, but the silence it left behind was a wound that refused to heal. Her life was a fortress of routine, each day a perfect, beautiful, empty replica of the one before. She managed the vineyard with cold efficiency. She ran her household with quiet dignity. She was a ghost in her own life, surrounded by the ghosts of the men she loved. Then one morning, a stranger appeared at her gate. He was a giant of a man, with shoulders as wide as an oak tree and hands that looked like they could crush stone. He stood there in worn-out boots and sun-faded clothes, holding his hat in his hands, his head bowed with a humility that seemed at odds with his sheer size. His name was Eli Creed. He was a cowboy, running from a past he never spoke of, carrying secrets that weighed heavier than any physical burden. He asked for nothing more than a day's work for a day's pay. Genevieve hired him. It was a decision made on pure instinct, a flicker of something in her long, dormant heart that she couldn't explain. She had no idea that she hadn't just hired a worker. She had just opened the door to a man who was about to bring her perfect, empty world crashing down around her. The man stood in her office, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was even more imposing up close. Well over 6 feet, with a weathered face that told a story of hard miles and open skies. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, weary brown, the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty, yet somehow they still held a capacity for gentleness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "Name's Eli Creed. Your foreman said you might have need of another hand." Genevieve maintained her composure, sitting behind the great oak desk that had been her husband's. It was a barrier, a symbol of her authority. "What kind of work are you looking for, Mr. Creed?" "Any kind you need done, ma'am." He didn't fidget. He didn't look away. He just stood there, a portrait of stillness and restrained power. "I'm good with horses. Can mend fences, handle heavy lifting. Been working ranches and farms most of my life." He paused, and his next words were delivered with a quiet, solid dignity. "I don't drink to excess. I don't cause trouble, and I work hard for my pay." She had interviewed dozens of men over the years. She knew the liars, the drifters, the ones whose promises dissolved with their first paycheck. This man was different. There was a truth in his bearing that she couldn't deny, a core of integrity that felt as solid as the mountains. "We pay standard wages," she said, testing him. "Room and board in the workers' quarters, Sundays off." "That's fair, ma'am. You understand that I run this operation. My word is final." She watched him closely, looking for the faintest hint of condescension, the subtle challenge she often faced from men who disliked taking orders from a woman. She found none. "Yes, ma'am," was all he said. "Jacob will show you to your quarters," she said finally, making a decision that felt both foolish and inevitable. "You'll start tomorrow at dawn." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm grateful for the opportunity." He turned to leave but paused at the door. He looked back at her, and his gaze was direct and sincere. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I understand this is your home, and I respect that. You won't have any trouble from me." After he left, the office felt cavernously empty again. She sat for a long time, the silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. The encounter had unsettled her, stirring a curiosity she hadn't felt in years. Through the window, she watched him walk toward the workers' quarters, his long strides eating up the ground. There was something in the way he moved, a careful control, that suggested he was holding back a great deal more than he showed. What secrets were hidden behind those gentle eyes? What story had carved those lines on his face? That night, She dismissed the feeling as simple curiosity about a new employee. But as she lay in her large, empty bed, she realized she was looking forward to the morning in a way she hadn't in a very, very long time. She had no idea that the trouble he promised not to bring wasn't the kind he could control. It was the kind that arrived like a force of nature, with the power to destroy everything in its path. The storm hit on Eli's third day. It came without warning, a black wall of fury that rolled over the hills and slammed into Willow Ridge. Genevieve woke to the sound of wind screaming like a banshee and rain hammering the roof like a drum corps of madmen. She threw on her clothes and ran downstairs, her heart pounding with the familiar terror every vineyard owner feels when nature declares war. From the kitchen window, the scene was one of chaos. The vines, her precious, carefully tended vines, were bent nearly double. Workers ran for cover. And then she saw it. A flash of lightning, a deafening crack, and a massive oak branch splintered, crashing down and taking a whole section of the north field fence with it. "Mrs. Ashcraft-Oft!" Martha, her housekeeper, cried out. "Jacob's here. He says the equipment barn roof is about to go." Genevieve grabbed a rain slicker and plunged into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore her off her feet. She fought her way to the barn, where Jacob, her sturdy foreman, was trying to direct a panicked crew. "How bad is it?" she screamed over the howl of the wind. "Bad enough!" Jacob yelled back, his face a grim mask. "The north fence is gone. The creek is rising. If it floods the new plantings, we'll lose the whole section." His words were cut short by another monstrous crack of thunder. This time it wasn't a branch. A whole tree gave way, its roots tearing from the saturated ground. It fell with a gut-wrenching groan, smashing through the roof of the equipment barn. Splintered wood and shingles flew through the air. Expensive tools and machinery were instantly exposed to the pelting, fist-sized hail that had joined the assault. Genevieve watched in horror, helpless, as a year's worth of investment was being destroyed in minutes. And that's when she saw him. Eli Creed. He wasn't running for cover. He was running toward the danger. His massive frame seemed to carve a path through the storm, the wind and rain parting before him. Without a moment's hesitation, he charged into the wreckage of the barn and began hauling equipment out, his movements swift and sure. "Eli!" she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Jacob grabbed her arm. "Too dangerous, ma'am! The whole roof could come down!" But Eli was deaf to the danger. He was a general on a battlefield. He organized the younger, panicked workers into a human chain, passing tools and supplies from the collapsing barn to the safety of the main building. His calm, commanding voice cut through the chaos, giving orders that the others followed without question. A heavy support beam, groaning under the weight of the damaged roof, began to sag ominously right above them. The other workers scattered. Eli didn't. He planted his feet, looked up, and positioned himself directly beneath it. He took the massive weight on his shoulders, his muscles straining, his face a mask of pure determination, holding the roof up just long enough for the others to clear the last of the valuable equipment. Genevieve watched, breathless. It was an act of impossible strength and unbelievable courage. This man, this stranger she barely knew, was risking his life to protect her property, to protect her legacy. When the worst of the storm finally passed, leaving a trail of wreckage and ruin, she knew it could have been so much worse. The damage was extensive, but it wasn't total. And that was because of Eli. She found him by the north field, already clearing debris from the broken fence. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. He looked up, his brown eyes holding that same careful respect. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "What you did, saving the equipment, that was above and beyond." He just nodded, wiping rain from his face. "Storms don't care who you are, ma'am." Seemed like the right thing to do. He turned back to the fence, running a hand along a splintered post. "This isn't just storm damage," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "These posts were already weak. See here?" He pointed to the base where the wood was soft with rot. "Been compromised for a while. The storm just finished what time already started." Genevieve knelt beside him. She'd walked this fence line 1,000 times and never noticed. How did you see that? Spent a lot of time fixing things that were broken, he said simply. You learned to look for the problems underneath the problems. There was a double meaning in his words that hung in the air between them. He was talking about more than just fence posts. She watched him, really watched him, for the first time. She saw the quiet competence, the deep understanding of how things worked and how they broke. She was beginning to realize that this wandering cowboy was far more than he appeared. He had saved her equipment. He had seen the hidden decay in her fences, but as she looked at the wreckage of the storm and the quiet strength of the man who had faced it down, a chilling thought crossed her mind. He was right. You had to look for the problems underneath the problems. And she had no idea that the biggest problem at Willow Ridge wasn't the storm, or the fence, or the rot. It was the man standing right in front of her. In the days that followed the storm, a new rhythm settled over Willow Ridge. It was a rhythm of rebuilding, of repairing, but it felt different. It felt hopeful. And the center of that hope was Eli Creed. He was the first one working at dawn, and the last one to leave at dusk. He rebuilt the north fence, not just patching it, but replacing the rotten posts with solid cedar, sinking them deep into the earth. Do it right the first time, he told Jakob, and it'll hold for 20 years. Genevieve found herself watching him, not just as an employer, but as a woman intrigued. She noticed the small things, the way he carved new support stakes for the young vines, each one smoothed by hand, because he said the metal ones were too harsh. The way he reorganized the tool shed with an engineer's precision. But it was his gentleness that struck her most deeply. It was a strange contrast to his immense strength. She saw it in the way he handled the delicate vines, his large, calloused hands moving with the grace of a surgeon. Then, one morning, she saw something that changed her perception of him forever. She was walking through the stables when she heard a sound, a low, melodic humming. She followed it to a stall in the back and peered around the corner. Eli was kneeling on the straw-covered ground. Beside him lay the young foal that had been injured during the storm, its leg carefully bandaged. He was stroking the small animal's neck, his touch infinitely patient. And he was singing. It was a lullaby, a soft, gentle tune that sent a shock through Genevieve's heart. It was the same lullaby she had sung to her son, Michael, when he was a baby. The same one Thomas used to hum when he worked late in his study. "Hush now, little one," Eli murmured to the foal, his voice a warm, quiet whisper. "You're going to be just fine. That leg will heal strong." The foal, which had been skittish and frightened since its injury, seemed to relax under his touch, its breathing evening out. "The storm scared you, didn't it?" Eli continued, his words meant for the horse, but they hit Genevieve like an arrow. "I know something about being scared. Sometimes the world feels like it's falling down around you, and you don't know if you're strong enough to stand back up." Genevieve stood frozen, hidden in the shadows, feeling as if he were speaking directly to her soul. She thought of the long, empty nights after the telegram, the crushing weight of grief, the fear that she would never be whole again. "But here's what I learned," Eli said, his voice filled with a hard-won wisdom. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let somebody help you. Sometimes healing happens best when you're not trying to do it all alone." He began to sing again, a wordless, haunting melody that was so full of sorrow and hope that it brought tears to Genevieve's eyes. In that moment, he wasn't a hired hand. He was something else entirely, a man who understood pain in a way few people did. Mrs. Ashcraft-Oft. She started. He had seen her. His brown eyes met hers, and the quiet intimacy of the moment hung in the air. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping into the light. "I heard the singing." She looked down at the foal. "How is she?" "She's doing better," Eli said, a faint smile touching his lips. "The leg wasn't broken, just badly bruised. She'll recover." Genevieve knelt beside him. "You have a gift with animals." He shrugged, a hint of color rising in his weathered cheeks. "They're honest creatures. They don't pretend to be something they're not." The words were a subtle jab, though she wasn't sure at whom. She found herself studying his hands as he checked the foal's bandages. They were scarred and rough, but they moved with a tenderness that was mesmerizing. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "The bandaging. It's as good as any veterinarian's." His hands stilled for a fraction of a second. A shadow passed over his face, a memory he quickly pushed away. "You pick things up when you're traveling," he said vaguely. "Sometimes there's no doctor around." It wasn't the whole truth. She knew it. But she also knew that pushing him would only make him retreat. Instead, she found herself opening up to him. "My son loved horses," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "He was planning to breed them when he came home from the war." Eli didn't offer platitudes or sympathy, he just listened. "He sounds like he had good dreams," he said quietly. "He did," she whispered. "Sometimes I think the hardest part isn't that he's gone, it's that all those dreams died with him." Eli looked from the foal to her, his gaze steady and profound. "Dreams don't always die, ma'am. Sometimes they just get passed on to different hands." His simple words offered her a perspective she hadn't considered in 3 years of grieving. Not an ending, but a continuation. As they left the stable, she felt lighter than she had in ages. He had shown her a gentleness she hadn't known existed, and a wisdom that seemed to come from a place of deep suffering. But his words about dreams being passed on echoed in her mind. It was a beautiful thought. It was also a dangerous one. Because she was starting to dream again, and she was terrified of where those dreams might lead. The vineyard was coming alive again. Not just the vines, but the people. In the weeks that followed, a new energy pulsed through Willow Ridge. The workers were more motivated, the atmosphere less somber. As Martha the housekeeper put it, "It feels like we're building something again, instead of just keeping things from falling apart." The change was Eli. His influence was quiet but profound. He suggested planting cover crops between the rows of vines to hold moisture in the soil. "My father used to do it on his small vineyard back in Missouri," he'd explained. "Increased his yield by nearly 20%. Genevieve found herself seeking out his company, walking the fields with him in the mornings. He taught her to see the vineyard not as a business, but as a living thing. He showed her how to read the language of the leaves, the texture of the soil. "You're thinking like a manager," he told her one afternoon. "Sometimes you need to think like the vine." Working beside him was comfortable. The long silences weren't awkward, they were peaceful. The shared labor felt less like work and more like a partnership. She found herself smiling more. She even found herself laughing. She hadn't realized how much she'd changed until Eli pointed it out. "You're enjoying this," he observed one evening as they were tying new growth to the support wires. "What makes you say that?" "You smile when you work with the vines," he said simply. "You didn't used to." The observation caught her off guard. The fact that he'd noticed, that he'd been watching her that closely, sent a warm, unfamiliar flutter through her chest. This connection, this feeling that was growing between them, was becoming impossible to ignore. It was also becoming impossible to hide. One afternoon, as the harvest approached, a vital piece of machinery in the processing barn broke down. Not just broke, it had been tampered with. A critical belt had been sliced almost all the way through, clearly an act of sabotage. It was a costly and dangerous failure that could have seriously injured someone. Jakob, her loyal foreman, came to her, his face grim. "It was deliberate, ma'am," he said. "No doubt about it." "But who would do such a thing?" Genevieve asked, shocked. Jakob hesitated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "The belt was fine yesterday. Only one person has been spending time in there tuning the equipment." The implication was clear. Eli. "That's ridiculous, Jakob," she snapped, more sharply than she intended. "Eli would never—" "Ma'am," Jakob interrupted, his voice firm but respectful. "He's a good worker, I'll grant you that. The best we've ever had. But we don't know anything about him. A man with no past is a man with something to hide." His words were a cold splash of water. She had been so caught up in her growing feelings, in the hope he represented, that she had ignored the mystery that surrounded him. 2 days later, it happened again. A section of her most valuable vines, the ones that produced their award-winning Cabernet, were wilting. The leaves were yellowing, the grapes shriveling. When she and Eli investigated, they found the problem. The irrigation line that fed that specific section had been crimped, cutting off the water supply. It was hidden beneath the soil, another clear act of sabotage. That night, Jakob came to her again. "I saw him," he said, his voice low and strained. "I couldn't sleep, so I was walking the grounds. I saw Eli near that section of vines. It was late. He was just standing there, in the dark." A cold dread washed over Genevieve. What was he doing? "I don't know. When he saw me, he just nodded and walked away. But it wasn't right, ma'am. Something isn't right." Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Could it be true? Was this gentle, wise man she was falling for secretly destroying her vineyard from within? Was his kindness a mask? Was his competence a weapon he was using against her? She had to know the truth. The next morning, she told her staff she was going into town for supplies. But that wasn't her real destination. She needed answers. She needed to know who Eli Creed really was. She drove her buggy into town, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what she was looking for. A record? A piece of mail? Anything that might shed some light on the man who had so completely captured her heart and now threatened to shatter her world. She went to the general store, her mind still churning, and that's where she found it. Pinned to a public notice board, tucked behind an advertisement for a county fair, was a piece of paper. It was old and yellowed, the ink faded. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was of a younger man, his face harder, his eyes colder, but it was him, unmistakably him. She ripped it from the board, her hands shaking. She read the words, and the floor seemed to fall away beneath her. Wanted for armed robbery. Eli Creed. $500 reward. Armed robbery. The words echoed in the sudden silence of her mind. The man who sang lullabies to injured animals. The man who carved vine stakes with an artist's touch. The man whose gentleness had healed a part of her she thought was dead forever. A wanted criminal. She stumbled out of the store, the poster clutched in her hand. The ride home was a blur. Everything was a lie. His kindness, his respect, his wisdom, all of it, a performance, a calculated deception. Jakob was right. A man with no past is a man with something to hide. She held the poster in her trembling hand. The face was his. The crime was unthinkable. And she was riding straight back to the man who was either her salvation or her absolute doom. She found him in the North Vineyard, tasting grapes for sweetness, a picture of peaceful diligence. The setting sun cast a golden glow around him, making him look like a saint. The irony was a knife in her gut. He looked up as she approached, a warm, open smile on his face. "How was your trip to town?" Her heart shattered into a million pieces. That smile. How could that smile be a lie? She couldn't speak. She just held out the wanted poster. The smile vanished from his face. He looked at the paper, and then he looked at her. She watched for shock, for denial, for anger. She saw none of it. What she saw was a slow, soul-crushing resignation, an acceptance that told her everything. The jig was up. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Does it matter?" She shot back, her voice cold and brittle. "Is it true?" He was silent for a long, agonizing moment. He looked down at the ground, at the rich soil they had tended together. When he finally lifted his head, the pain in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. "Yes," he said. The single word was a death sentence for every hope she'd nurtured, every feeling she'd allowed to grow. It all turned to ash. 7 years ago, he began, his voice rough with a shame that felt ancient. "In Colorado, I was a different man then, angry, desperate. Desperate enough for armed robbery?" She sneered, her grief twisting into rage. "My family had a farm," he said, the words torn from him. "Drought hit, 3 years running. The bank, the same one we were supposed to rob, they took everything. Our land, our home. My father was a proud man. He couldn't take the shame. My parents, they didn't survive the winter after that. They died in a boarding house, broken. The story was heartbreaking, but she hardened her heart against it. That doesn't justify what you did. No, he agreed, his gaze unflinching. It doesn't. But my sister was sick. She was starving. And I was 22 and I'd just watched my parents die because of that bank's greed. I convinced myself it was justice. Your sister? She asked, remembering the worn letter he carried. The one who wrote you the letter? He winced, as if she'd struck him. She died while I was on the run. Pneumonia. She died alone in a charity hospital because I was a coward, hiding in the mountains. The weight of his confession was suffocating. She was torn between betrayal and a sympathy that infuriated her, and underneath it all a stubborn, stupid love that refused to die. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Because I knew this would happen. His voice broke. I knew if you found out, everything would change, and I... He stopped, wrestling with the words. You what? He looked at her, and all the walls he'd built around himself crumbled, revealing the raw, vulnerable heart of the man beneath. I fell in love with you, Genevieve, with your strength, your kindness, the way you fought to keep this place alive. I fell in love with the person I got to be when I was with you, someone decent, someone worthy. His confession was the cruelest blow of all. It should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it was a confirmation of the impossible chasm between them. I have to ask you to leave, she said, the words tasting like poison. Each one was a betrayal of her own heart, but she saw no other way. I can't have someone with your past here. I can't have a criminal on my property. He nodded slowly, his face a mask of defeat. He had expected this. I understand, he said. I'll be gone by morning. He turned to walk away, his shoulders slumped under a weight far heavier than any sagging roof beam. He paused and looked back at her one last time. For what it's worth, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. These past few months, they've been the best of my life. You gave me a reason to be a better man. She watched him go, a part of her screaming to call him back, to tell him it didn't matter. But it did matter. The sabotage, the lies, the wanted poster, it all mattered. He told her he loved her. But how could she love a man whose past was a shadow that could destroy everything she had left? With a heart that felt like it had been ripped from her chest, she told him the one thing she knew she had to say. Leave. Eli was gone. The vineyard, which had been so full of life and promise just days before, was silent again. It was an emptiness worse than her grief, because this time she had chosen it. She told Jacob that Eli had left for personal reasons. The foreman looked relieved, but also confused. The acts of sabotage had stopped the moment Eli departed, seemingly confirming his guilt. Genevieve moved through her days in a fog of heartbreak, convinced she had made the only possible choice. She had a reputation to protect, a business to run. She couldn't afford a scandal. 3 days after Eli left, a group of riders appeared on the road to the manor. At their head was Harrison Blackwood, a wealthy and ruthless land baron who had been trying to buy her vineyard for years. Thomas had always despised him, calling him a vulture who fed on the misfortunes of others. Blackwood dismounted, his movements arrogant and proprietary. He was flanked by several other local landowners, men whose respect she had fought hard to earn. Mrs. Ashcraftoft, Blackwood said, his smile thin and predatory. A word, if you please. I'm busy, Mr. Blackwood, she said coldly. I'm sure you are. Running a large estate is difficult work, especially for a woman alone. His eyes glinted with malice. I've come with some disturbing news. He reached into his coat pocket. Genevieve's blood ran cold. He pulled out a piece of paper, a copy of Eli's wanted poster. I hear you've been harboring a criminal, he said, his voice loud enough for the other men to hear. A violent fugitive. It's a dangerous thing, a woman like you, all alone out here. It shows poor judgment. The world tilted on its axis. Mr. Creed is no longer in my employ. she managed to say, her voice tight. But he was, Blackwood pressed, circling like a shark. For weeks, gaining your trust, learning the layout of your property. Who knows what information he gathered? Who knows who he was working for? It hit her like a physical blow. The sabotage, the broken equipment, the damaged vines. It wasn't Eli, it was Blackwood. He had been trying to create problems, to make her feel vulnerable, to make her think Eli was a threat, to drive him away. And it had worked. Perfectly. "What do you want, Blackwood?" she asked, her voice shaking with rage. "I want to help you," he said, the false sincerity sickening. "This is a terrible scandal. People will talk. They'll question your ability to manage this estate. Your bank may reconsider your loans. It could ruin you." He let the threat hang in the air. "However," he continued smoothly, "I am prepared to renew my generous offer to purchase Willow Ridge. It would allow you to escape this unpleasantness. Relocate, start fresh, away from the gossip." The trap was sprung. He was using Eli's past as a weapon to blackmail her, to steal her land, her home, her husband's legacy. He had orchestrated the entire thing. "And if I refuse?" Blackwood's smile turned venomous. "Then I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every soul in this valley knows that the respectable widow Ashcraft-Oft knowingly hired a wanted man, endangered her neighbors, and is unfit to run this business. I will destroy you." She looked at the faces of the other men. They were shifting uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. They were followers, swayed by power and fear. She was utterly, completely alone. She was trapped. Give up her home, her legacy, everything that connected her to Thomas and Michael, or face public ruin. Blackwood thought he had her cornered. He thought she would break. He was wrong. In that moment, something inside her ignited. A fire she thought had died with her husband and son. The quiet grief she had nursed for 3 years burned away, replaced by a cold, hard fury. She had survived the loss of her family. She had run this vineyard alone. She would not be broken by this vulture. "I will need time to consider your offer," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Of course," Blackwood said, confident in his victory. "But don't take too long." As they rode away, Genevieve stood in her yard, the dust settling around her. She was no longer just a widow. She was a fighter. Blackwood had made one fatal mistake. He had shown her the truth. He had proved that Eli wasn't the villain. He was the victim, just as she was, and she realized what she had to do. She wasn't just going to fight for her land. She was going to fight for him. She saddled her horse and slid her husband's Winchester rifle into its scabbard. She was going to find Eli Creed. But she had no idea that the danger was far worse than a greedy land baron. The real monster was still out there, hiding in the shadows, and he was much, much closer than she could ever imagine. She found him at an old, abandoned mining camp in the hills, a place for men who didn't want to be found. He was sitting by a small fire, a lonely figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. When he saw her riding toward him, his face was a canvas of shock and a hope so painful it broke her heart. "Genevieve," he said, standing up, "you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "I know," she said, dismounting. She told him everything, about Blackwood, the sabotage, the blackmail, the truth. As she spoke, his expression hardened, the gentle sadness in his eyes replaced by a cold, dangerous anger. "He's using me," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "Using my past to destroy you." He shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "This is my fault. You need to take his offer. Sell the vineyard and get away from this mess. Get away from me." "No." The word was steel. "I am not a victim, Eli, and I will not be bullied into abandoning my home." "You don't understand," he insisted, his voice raw with desperation. "Men like Blackwood, they don't stop. If he can't intimidate you, he'll escalate. You'll be in real danger." "Then help me fight him," she said, stepping closer, her eyes locked on his. "Help me protect what's mine." A flicker of hope crossed his face, but it was quickly extinguished by the shadow of his past. "I can't. My presence here is the weapon he's using against you. The best way I can protect you is to disappear." If you disappear, he wins, she countered, her voice rising with passion. He takes my land, and I lose the last thing that connects me to the life I built with my family. Is that what you want? The silence between them was thick with unspoken feelings, with the wreckage of their shattered trust and the fragile possibility of rebuilding. What are you asking me to do? He finally whispered. Come back, she said simply. Come back to Willow Ridge. Stand with me. Face this with me. And if they don't believe me? He asked, the shame still heavy in his voice. If the whole town sees me as nothing but the criminal on that poster? She reached into her saddlebag, pulled out the wanted poster she had taken from the general store, and ripped it cleanly in half. The two pieces fluttered to the dusty ground. Then we'll prove them wrong, she said. Together. She saw the battle raging in his eyes, the desire to believe her warring with a lifetime of running. Genevieve, he said, his voice grave. There's more. Something that makes this 100 times more dangerous. Her stomach tightened. What is it? Blackwood didn't find that poster by accident. Someone told him. Someone from my past. Eli's jaw tightened. My old partner from that robbery, a man named Dutch Henley. He's here in this valley, and he's the one who was sabotaging your vineyard. The revelation was a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a land dispute anymore. What does he want? She breathed. Revenge. Money. Dutch was always the snake. He enjoyed the violence. I left him after the robbery, and he's never forgiven me for it. He's working with Blackwood. He's the muscle, the real threat. The fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach. But her resolve was harder. All the more reason for you to come back, she said, her own courage surprising her. If this man is as dangerous as you say, then I need someone by my side that I can trust. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. You want me to protect you from the consequences of my own past? I want you, she said, her voice softening as she finally spoke the deepest truth in her heart. Because whatever you were 7 years ago, I know who you are now, and I trust that man with my life. The words were a key, unlocking the final chamber of his guarded heart. The shame, the fear, it all washed away, replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. If I come back, he said, his voice thick with emotion, there's no more hiding. For either of us, everyone will know. Genevieve smiled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. A true, radiant smile. Good, she said. They rode back to Willow Ridge together, two lonely warriors who had finally found their battlefield. They were riding toward a confrontation that could cost them everything. But for the first time, they weren't riding alone. They arrived back at the vineyard as the sun was setting, painting the sky in defiant strokes of orange and red. The air was thick with tension, the calm before the inevitable storm. They didn't have to wait long. Dawn broke, gray and misty, and with it came the thunder of hooves. Blackwood was back, and this time, he wasn't here to negotiate. He had a dozen men with him, a mix of his usual cronies and hard-faced men who looked like they were paid to ask no questions. Riding beside him, a cruel smirk on his scarred face, was Dutch Henley. Genevieve and Eli stood waiting on the front porch. She held Thomas's Winchester, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in her hands. Eli stood beside her, perfectly still, his presence a mountain of quiet strength. "Mrs. Ashcraft-Oft!" Blackwood shouted, his voice dripping with false concern. "I see you've made a poor choice. It's over. You're harboring a known fugitive." "The only thing over, Mr. Blackwood, is your welcome on my property," Genevieve called back, her voice ringing with a clarity and force that surprised even herself. "Leave now." Dutch Henley urged his horse forward, his cold eyes fixed on Eli. "Well, well, partner," he drawled. "Look at you. Playing house, did you tell the pretty widow about the blood on your hands?" "This has nothing to do with her, Dutch," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "Oh, I think it has everything to do with her," Henley sneered. "Once we're done with you, Mr. Blackwood and I are going to take very good care of her." and her lovely vineyard. The threat was vile, unmistakable. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Genevieve. She raised the rifle, settling the stock against her shoulder. Blackwood laughed. "What are you going to do, little lady? You and your jailbird boyfriend against all of us?" The situation was hopeless. 2 people against a small army. And then they heard it. A sound from the road, the sound of more horses, many more. Over the rise came a group of riders. At the front was Jacob, his face set with determination. Beside him was Martha's husband, Tom, and a dozen other vineyard workers, armed with pitchforks and heavy tools. But behind them were others. Samuel Morrison, the cattle rancher who had stood with Blackwood just days before. Dr. Patterson, the town physician. The schoolteacher, the blacksmith, a dozen more townspeople and neighbors. They rode into the yard and formed a silent, solid wall behind Genevieve and Eli. Blackwood's jaw dropped. Samuel Morrison dismounted and walked to the front, tipping his hat to Genevieve. "Morning, Mrs. Ashcraft-Oft. Heard you might be having some trouble." "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "Some of us got to thinking," Morrison said, his voice loud and clear for all to hear. "We got to thinking about what we actually know versus what we've been told by men like Mr. Blackwood. What we know is that Eli Creed is the hardest worker we've ever seen. What we know is that he risked his life to save this vineyard in the storm. What we know," Dr. Patterson added, "is that a man's past doesn't have to be his future. This community believes in second chances." Dutch Henley's face contorted with rage. "You people are fools! He's a killer! A thief!" "The only thief I see here," said Martha, stepping out from the crowd, her hands on her hips, "is Harrison Blackwood, trying to steal a woman's home." Suddenly, a sound echoed across the valley, the deep, resonant ringing of the vineyard's old watchtower bell. Jacob had climbed the tower and was pulling the rope, sending out the signal that had called the community together for generations. It was a call to arms. Genevieve stood tall, the rifle steady in her hands. "That bell," she declared, her voice filled with the power of her ancestors, "is the sound of this community. It rang when my husband and son went to war, and it rang when they didn't come home. It tells the world that we stand together. We protect our own." She looked directly at Blackwood, her eyes blazing. "You and your men have 1 minute to leave my property. After that, you are trespassers, and we will treat you as such." The standoff was absolute. Dutch Henley's hand twitched toward his gun, but he was no longer facing a lone man and a widow. He was facing a wall of determined faces. He was facing a family. Blackwood, pale with fury and humiliation, saw his power evaporate. He had lost. "This isn't over," he spat, but the threat was hollow. He and his men turned their horses and rode away in disgrace, the jeers of the community following them down the road. The yard erupted in cheers. The bell kept ringing, a triumphant celebration of victory. Eli's hand found hers, his fingers lacing with her own. It was warm, strong, and steady. In his eyes, she saw not just love, but a future they had fought for side by side. The danger had passed, but the real journey was just beginning. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the hills of Willow Ridge. Genevieve stood on the porch of the manor, but she wasn't alone. A simple, beautiful ring, crafted by Eli from twisted vineyard wire, graced her finger. They had been married a month ago, a small ceremony under the great oak trees, attended by the entire community. It wasn't a union of 2 perfect people. It was a union of 2 survivors, 2 souls who had found in each other the strength to heal. The vineyard was thriving. The harvest had been the best in its history, a testament to Eli's knowledge and hard work. He was no longer just a worker. He was a partner, a leader, respected and admired by all. Blackwood had sold his lands and left the valley, his reputation in tatters. Dutch Henley had vanished, a bitter ghost swallowed by the past. "What are you thinking about?" Eli asked, his arms wrapping around her waist from behind. His touch was home. "I was thinking," she said, leaning back against his solid chest, "that I spent 3 years believing my life was over, that the best I could hope for was to preserve a memory." She turned in his arms to face him. I never imagined I could build something new. We built it, he said, his smile erasing the last of the weary lines around his eyes. Together. Later that day, he led her to the barn. I have something for you, he said. He unveiled a magnificent desk, handcrafted from local oak. The wood was carved with intricate patterns of grapevines and roses, her favorite flower. It was for the new tasting room they were building, the one that had been her husband's dream. It's beautiful, Eli, she whispered, her heart full. There's one more thing, he said. He opened a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, were 2 wine glasses. But they were unlike any she had ever seen. The stems were hand-carved from single pieces of wood, shaped into miniature, perfect grapevines. They were masterpieces of love and patience. In that moment, she understood. Eli wasn't just replacing what she had lost. He was helping her build upon it, making the legacy of the vineyard richer and stronger than ever before. The watchtower bell began to ring, calling everyone to the midday meal. As they walked toward the house, hand in hand, the sound was different. It was no longer a sound of loss or alarm. It was the sound of life, of community, of continuity. It was the sound of home. A home they had built together, not from perfect pieces, but from the broken fragments of 2 lives, made whole by a love that was strong enough to weather any storm. Some people say the strongest hearts are found in the most broken places. Genevieve now knew that was true. And she knew that sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with a fairy tale, but with a quiet promise to face the storm, together. If you believe in second chances, don't forget to subscribe, because the stories we share here are proof that the most beautiful harvests often grow from the most difficult soil.